So let's continue with where we left off on part one. So now it's part two, and we're actually going to deal with the functionality of the project. But before we actually do much coding, let's install Axios. Axios is a HTTP or a JavaScript library that we're going to use to make HTTP requests. Because remember, we are dealing with an API, which is a sort of like an external source for us where we're going to fetch data. So we're going to use Axios instead of using fetch. With fetch, our code will get a bit messier. So I thought like maybe it's appropriate if I use Axios. Axios will make our code to be more linear and easy to maintain and readable, right? So let's install the library. We're just gonna use, let's open another terminal here. We're going to use the same command we used to install the React router, npm install Axios. Let's give it a minute. Okay, now it's done. So what we need to do, I need us to set up a file specifically for Axios so that we can be able to configure it. Let's create a file here. Okay, let's just create a file called axios.js, and let's import Axios, which is the library we just installed, from Axios. What we need to do is to export default, let's say the base URL Axios. So it allows you to configure, this instance so that you can be able to use it the way you see it fit, right? So let's create, and then we're gonna pass it an object with a few properties. The first property is the base URL. So the base URL is where is the base URL of your API, or where your external source is, so where you're going to fetch data, right? And then it also allows you to, for you also have an auth where you can pass in the auth token. There is a bunch of stuff that you can use here, but then for now we only need this one. We only need this base URL. So where is this base URL? So let's head back to Chrome. So here we have the API, the GitHub API. So you can go to api.github.com. It's gonna bring you here. So these are a bunch of URLs or routes that you can use for your project. But then for this project specifically, we're going to focus on three URLs. The first one is this one: user search URL, user repositories URL, and then user URL. And then if you can look at these URLs, they all have a common URL, or yeah, this part here is common in here. So this is basically our base URL, and then let me grab it and head back to VS Code, and let's paste the link here. Let me remove this part. Cool. So now we can just import this file or this into our project, and we'll be able to use Axios. So the base URL that it's gonna use, without actually having to tell it, is going to use this one, and then you can append on top of this URL when you wanna make a request that is not at this URL. So you'll see in a few minutes. So let's head back to our home page. Let's head back to our home page, and what do we need? So let's deal with here what happens when you click a button, what happens. So let's import, no, let's use states. right? And here where we're going to store your query, that query, which is gonna be an empty string. Okay, and we also need, okay, let me see, handle query input, which is a function, and we pass in this value here, passing the so let's come here and say value is the query, and then on change. So whenever the value in this input changes, on change, whenever the value in this input changes, we're gonna call this function handle query input. What we're gonna basically do is do this value, grab the value from this object target dot value and say set query value. Okay, so far we are actually grabbing the value from the input, right? What do we also need? So basically we're gonna also have a function here which we're gonna call whenever the button is clicked, handle search users. So let's have this function handle search users, which also takes in, which takes the object to, and then we're gonna prevent the page from doing a form submission. For now, let's just leave it here. So let's think about what do we need to do whenever this button is clicked. So whenever this button is clicked, we need to go and fetch this data, right? Let me close this. So whenever the user clicks this button, we need to fetch the data, right? So let's also import the Axios so we can be able to fetch the data. Import Axios. We're not actually going to import Axios, the library we installed, but we're gonna use the Axios from the file we created. So this is where it is, not necessarily the library. So make sure you, when you import Axios, you are actually importing this one, not the one we installed. Okay. So let's have a function called fetch users. Fetch users. What's going on? Search users, which is gonna be an asynchronous function because we are going to perform some API call. Okay, and so what do we need? So we also need to have a use state for users. Users fetched from the API. Users set users. Oh no. And then it's gonna be an empty array. So let's do the fetch, and then let's have a try catch here. So whenever some error happens, we are able to catch it. So let's do constant response await, and we're gonna say Axios no, and no, get. And then when you use the get, so you are basically saying you're going to fetch data from somewhere. So here you need to specify where you're actually going to fetch the data from, right? So we've already specified the base URL, so we just need to append it so we can go specifically where we want to go. So for example here, we want to use this one, right? So we already have this part here, so all we need to do is append with search users, and then the question mark q equals, and then we give it the query, right? So let's go back here. So we're gonna say search users, search users, and then search users, and it's followed by the query, which is our query here. Let's do console.error and print out the error here. For now, let's also, oh no, let's also print out the response. Let's console log the response and see what actually does this API return when we search this. So fetch users, but we need to call this function. Let's just call it in here. So since this is an asynchronous function, so we need to use the await. So also this function is gonna become an asynchronous function. So say fetch users, save. Let's go back to our project here. So let's search Vincent and see what does the API return. Base URL is not defined. Okay, let's go back here. What's going on? Oh, let's not use, let's just say URL. Okay, let me refresh and see if I still have the same error. Okay, and the problem's gone. Let's search. So here's the response that we are printing out. It returns a couple of things. So it's an object and it contains properties. We have config, we have data, and then for us we're actually going to focus on data. We are actually going to focus only on data. That's the data it returned. And then it also has a total count. So your query matched this number of users or this number of accounts, and this is the items. The items is an array which contains users that match your query, but it doesn't actually return all of them. It returns a certain number per page. By default it returns 30, so you actually need to specify the number of users it needs to return. So but then by default it returns 30, and then the total count is 30,208. So let's focus on data. We need data and items, and then inside items you have an object, right? You have an object, and then this object is actually the user that matched your query. You have the type, you have the login, you have the ID, you have a bunch of stuff. You also have an avatar URL, I believe. Let's look at here. You have a avatar URL that we're gonna use to display the image of, or the avatar of that account. So let's head back to our avatar URL. We're gonna use the avatar URL. We also have an ID, and we also need the name. Do we have the name of the user? Let's see what we need here too. Okay, we need this login. So we're gonna, so instead of, for the name of the user, we're gonna print out login. Let's see. Yes, we're actually going to print out the login. The login is actually the name of this account, so we're going to print out that one. Okay, so let's head back to the code since we have seen what this response looks like. And then since we only need this data, I think we just need to destructure it, we need to destructure it from the response. Instead of having something like this, we just need to do this, and then we already have an access to this data. And also remember, we need the items. We don't need incomplete results. We don't need to deal with it. We also don't need to deal with the total count. So what we can do is come here, return data, and then items. Whenever there's an issue here, you can return null. So now we have fetched the users, so we need to display the users, right? Okay, we need to use this function to call, we need to use this function so we can display the users whenever this function is called. So this function is called when the button is clicked. So on button click, we need to do fetch and then display the users, right? So here, let me do if search is valid. So if the search, no, not search, is it what? If query is not empty, we actually need to do what? We need to do some fetch. Remember, so this one returns the data, right? The array. So let's say, let's have access to the data returned items, and then we need to set users. So this, the data this fetch users returns is the list, is the array of users. So we need to put it into our state here, say items, else we can do what? Console log your query is empty, your query is empty. Okay, but then remember, we still haven't displayed the results here. So let's try to display the results once they get returned. Where do we display them? Here. Remember, this was just a mock data, so this is not the actual data we return. So we need to remove this bunch of mock data here, and then actually display the actual data we returned from the GitHub. So let me delete the rest of the stuff. Where does it end? Yo, there's a lot. Think up until here. Okay. Users. Okay. And then one thing is that you can also make this whole block of code here to be a component, right? Instead of having this many divs in here, we can just make a component called user, where we actually going to pass a prop of user information, and it's just gonna display it. So let's go into our components here and create a folder called UI, and then in here we're gonna have a So import react constant user return. Oh, what happened here? And then it takes in let's say it's user. Let's go back to home, take the whole div. Is it here? Okay, and come in here and do this. So we're gonna pass in a user. Let's do this. Let's go back here. So remember, we are actually trying to display the users. We fetched them, but we haven't displayed them. So let's what do we do now? Okay, let's come here, say users. If we have something, what do? We actually need to users and map, use map to display the users. And then now we have an access to a user, return user. Let's import it. We actually need the one under UI, and it has a prop of user. Let's pass in the user, and then we need to give it a key. So this data, if you look at this item array here, all of them, they have an ID, so we can use it to uniquely identify these and say user dot id. And then if you go into, okay, no, there's still something we need to finish up here. Else, so we're using this 10 at else print out something. What are we gonna print out? H2. There's nothing to show, there's nothing to display. Okay, so let's go into what? Let's go into user component, and so we're going to have, instead of actually displaying this mock data here, we need to display a couple of stuff. So we need the login, we need the ID, and the avatar. So we can also destructure them from this object. We need avatar, URL, login, and ID from this object user. Here, let's just say login. It's gonna be our, and then let's remove this link, we no longer need it. We're gonna say avatar, URL, the name, we're gonna say login, the ID is the ID, and then no, what is this? And then ID, and then view profile. We actually need to view profile. When you view profile is when you move to the next page, right? So when you move to the next page, that next page, the user page, it needs to know which user I must fetch from GitHub, right? So you need to pass in information using the link, using the URL parameter. So you need to pass information to the next page using the URL parameter. But we're not going to use this anchor tag here. We're actually going to use a link from the library we installed, React Router, and then I'm just gonna do link view profile So link takes a prop, which is a to prop which specifies the path you are going to, and we are saying we are going to user page. But then this user page, it needs to get certain information about this user so it can be able to access it from GitHub. So we're gonna pass that information using the URL parameter, and we're just gonna say slash and pass in the information or the unique uh, property that it can use to search the information about a specific user. And then for us, we're just going to use the login. If you look at the login, it's Vincent. They are all unique, so you could never have another Vincent like this or on GitHub. So it's a unique, it's sort of like an ID. It works similarly to an ID, how you'd use an ID to uniquely identify users. So you're gonna pass the login to the user page. So we are using the backticks here, and log in. I think we've written a lot of code without actually seeing how it works. Let's go back to home. If query search fetch users and pass them here, query is empty. Okay, let's refresh. Okay, let's search again, Vincent, if you're gonna get any use. Oh, let's search David. Cool, this is dope. Okay, so now when you click here, it takes you to this user page with this uh David login. So we're gonna use this David login to fetch data about David from GitHub. Does that make sense? Yes, we're gonna use this data as an ID that it can help us to get information about David from GitHub. So let's go back again here, say John. But then again, if you look at the results it returned here, it didn't actually return all the users. For example, remember when we searched Vincent, it had over 30,000 users that matched the query, but then here it only returned 30. So we sort of need pagination so we can be able to move forward and backwards. So I think we need to have something like pagination over here so we can be able to move to the next uh users that were not returning the first page, right? We move to page 2, page 3 until we actually get all the users, right? So let's go back to our code and implement sort of like pagination into our project. So let's put it here and do a div. So this div, we're gonna say, what we're gonna call the name, let's say more options. Those more options, and then we're gonna give the user to be we're gonna give the user the chance to specify the number of users it needs to return per page, and also the page the users can move to, right? You can move to page 1, 2, 3, and then you also wanna return 50 users per page or 10 users, right? So let's have something like select. So select is gonna specify the number of users it returns per page. Cool. Okay, so let's have select, but instead of having select like this, let's have a label, and then we're gonna put the select in here per page, and then below here we can actually have the select, but we don't need this part here. We're not actually going to accommodate it with give it a lot of options. We're just gonna give it maybe let's say you can return 10, 20, 50, maybe also 100. Let's display 10 here, 20, 30, 100, not 30 but 50. Also outside the label, we need paginated buttons, so the buttons you can click on, move forward and move backwards. But we're actually going to have two buttons. It's gonna be page 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 4 and 5, and so forth. So let's have a div. Do we need a div again? So let's have a div here called pagination. Pagination, and have two buttons in here. So this one is going to display page 1, this one is going to display page 2. Let's save and see how it actually looks. A mess, right? Obviously. So let's do some styling. So more options, select, and buttons. So home, come here, pagination, more options. We need the select. Okay, outline, none. Let's see, padding 10. I don't know. Oh, also while it's still loading, let's add border radius 5. Oh no, it's too big. It's too big. 5 here. I think also this styling can apply to the buttons for pagination. So let's do more options and say specify buttons, or you can also just do pagination button, and let's see how it looks. No, we don't need the border. None. And then what we can do is we can leave the page per page section here, this label and this select here, and then move the buttons to right. So you can have the page here, and then you can have the pagination here. So let's go back to home and see what's okay. The parent div is more options. So let's do, we're gonna use the hack again, display flags and push them and spread them. Flags direction gonna be row, and is it justify content space between, let's see, with space between. How does it look? Oh, looks pretty much okay. Let's give it some margin. You can see like it's too close to the top. Let's say margin top 10. And then also the buttons, let's give them some styling so we can see them. Paginated buttons, and then background color. Yeah, let's use this one. And color obviously is gonna be something light. Let's save and see. Okay, and then also let's separate them a bit. 0.5. All right, so we have this, but then this, we need to move these users, at least they can be on the same line. Let's see, what is this guy? Who's this guy? User padding. Is it the padding? Yes, it's the padding. Okay, let's go to user. Who is the user? We don't need this padding here. Let's see, how does it look now? I need them to be on the same page. Okay, cool, they're on the same line. So instead of just returning only these 30 users, we can specify the number of users we need to return, and also we can move forward, right? So let's deal with that. Before we actually even move to the users page. Let's actually deal with the home page, and we're gonna move to the users page, right? So let's do the pagination and then the page thing. So the page thing is just more of like limit, how many users do you want to return, and then on which page are you. So we need to go back to home and deal with that. So we can say we have, and also think about it this way: whenever the user clicks 10, it actually needs to return 10, right? And then whenever the user clicks page 3 or page 4, it actually moves to page 4. So our fetch will actually run every time there is a change to our page or to our page number. So whenever there is a change in here, we actually need to do another fetch from GitHub, right? So we're probably gonna need to use use effect, so it listens to changes that we make to uh this page here, the per page value and the pages, right? So let's have the use state here first. Say page constant page set page, and then by default let's have page 1, and then say per page, let's just say limit, that limit, and then by default let's have 10. But then for GitHub is actually 30, but then for us we're gonna return 10 for every query unless the user changes it. And then here let's have constant handle okay, think about it this way. So when the user clicks uh this this button, let's say this to page 2, it needs to move forward, right? So we're gonna have two functions: the function that takes us forward, and then a function that takes us what, backwards, right? So let's have two functions here. Say handle previous page, which will take us backward. Then we're gonna use it, obviously my favorite. So set handle previous page, we're gonna say set page. So we are moving backward, right? But then before we actually move backward, we need to check if page is on page 1, because let's verify if it's on page 1. If it's on page 1, we cannot move backward, we cannot move to page 0, right? So we need to verify if we are not on page 1. If you are on page 1, you just need to return 1, or you can also return just page, right? Else return page -1. So now it means we are not on page 1, we are being on page 10. So we're gonna say page 10 -1, which will mean we are moving, sorry, we are moving back to page 9. And then we're gonna also need to have a function here, handle next page, which will pretty much do the same thing like this one, but we don't necessarily need to have this check here, that page, and then I'm just gonna say page, and then we can do return, but since it's a single line, we can just do this page, right? So whenever there is a button click for previous page, is gonna decrement the page number, and then whenever there's a page for they're requesting the next page, we're gonna increment it. And also we also need to listen to changes that happens on our select. So in the meantime, let's say on click. So this is gonna be our previous page. Handle previous page, and on click handle not previous, obviously, next page. And also here we need to say on change. Actually, this one, instead of having an on change here, I mean on click, we're gonna have on change. So whenever there's a change in these values, we're gonna call a function, say handle page limit. We don't have this one yet, so let's implement it. Let's implement constant handle page limit. So here we're going to limit the users we return per fetch. Yes, per fetch. So do this constant value, what is it, e dot target, and get the value. So we need to say set, is it set page limit, what is it, it's actually set limit. So set limit pass int, because this is a string, so we need actually the number. So we're gonna do this. However, by simply doing this, it does not necessarily mean let me save this. Let me show you something. It does not necessarily mean by implementing this function, it doesn't necessarily mean if we change here. Okay, let me say Vincent again. Do you see it doesn't actually fetch again? It doesn't. Okay, we also need to fix these buttons. So do you see it doesn't actually move forward? So let's actually make sure whenever there's a change here, it also going to return 20 users. If we move to 10, it's gonna return 10 users. Also here we need to be able to move back and forth. So we need to listen to those changes by simply using the use effect hook, which will listen to changes that happen to our limit and our page. But then we also saw that those pages don't change the page numbers. Oh, here we need to have something like we are on this page, and then you can move to page, let's see. Okay, let's see how this one looks. Okay, do you see page 1, page 3, page 3? Okay, cool. So I think we are getting there. So okay, what we need to do now is simply listen to those changes. Whenever those changes happen, we are actually going to run the hook. So let's import it here, the use effect hook, which will listen to whenever there's a change. So constant, no, not constant, we're actually using the effect. Gonna pass in the function, and also takes in the dependency array. So inside this dependency list or dependency array, we're gonna listen to changes. So if you leave it empty like this, it means it's only going to run once, because there isn't any. So it's gonna run only on load, since there are no changes that it's listening to, so it doesn't subscribe to anything. So once we say page, so whenever the page value changes, this hook will run again. So we're going to listen to page and what, and limit. So in here, what we need to do is to search, right? We need to display the users. So whenever this hook runs, we need to display users on different page or with a different limit. So let's have something like, let's have a function in here that will display the users on change. Display users on change. So whenever there's a change, this function will run. Also, this function or this hook will also run on page load, right? So whenever this page loads, it's gonna run this hook. So there are chances that when on page load, this query will be empty. So it's not necessary to make what, to make the query or to make the get request, because the search query is empty. So we need to verify that if the query is okay, we can do the search. So constant items, we actually just gonna use this. So if query has something, you can go ahead and do the search. If not, just skip it, because most probably when it loads, it's gonna try to run this function. But since we are having this safety check here, it will actually won't try to fetch any user because the query is empty. And then let's call the function. However, this is not enough. This will continue to run, but remember, in our fetch users here, in this function, we did not pass in this information, the page limit and the page. So whenever we call this function, it always returns the default page and then the default page limit. So we need to pass in those parameters, right? The URL parameters. So with this get function, you can actually pass in the second parameter, right? You can pass in the second argument, which is an object, and then in this object you can specify what are those uh additional information you want to pass into this URL. So this information is gonna go together with this URL. So that we're gonna pass in the parameters, and then since you saw that on this URL that we are currently using now, it takes in the page and then per page. We're not going to do the sort and order, we're just going to do page and per page. So we need to pass in this information, and we already have it. So you can say page and page like this, and per page, which is our limit. But then we can just remove this one like this. So I believe now, okay, so let's see if we are actually really oh my god, oh, we did not use the async here. Let's specify this as an asynchronous function. Let's go back here, let's reload. So we can say Vincent search. So now since our default is 10, it returned 10, right? And even let's see if we move to page 2. So it returns new users because we are now on page 2. And then we can specify that we need 100 users. You can also see here that we actually have returned lots of users. So you see now our pagination is working, right? We are on page 2. We can move to page 3, page 4, page 5. This is amazing. But then now we are only left with displaying this user's information, right? So we need to say, when we click on view profile, we need to be able to see the information related to this user. So let's implement that. So let's move to user, but first I need us to go into the app.js. So there is something here. So when you go to this route, you need to pass in certain information. So you need to tell React router that whenever someone goes to user something, it actually needs to render this page or this component, but then it should take this information as a parameter. It's not necessarily okay. Let me give you an example. Let's open this. Do you see it actually doesn't render anything because we did not specify this? We did not specify this path here. But then if I remove this part and I say user, it actually returns this mock here we just did. So it basically thinking, or it's basically thinking that if you don't specify, if you specify something, you are not referring to this. So if you specify something after this user, you are not referring to this route. So we need to tell it that whenever there's something after this user, you need to still render this page, but then we are going to use this information after this user as a parameter. So to do that, we need to say login, because remember we're gonna say have user and say jack. So this jack is the parameter. So we are specifying the parameter by using this colon here, and then specifying that information we're gonna access it using the login identifier, right? I hope that makes sense. So let's leave it like this and go to page user. So now since I specified on this page, on this line here, that anything that comes after this, we're gonna treat it as a login, and then it should return a user. So if we go here and say user jack, it should return that page. And then inside this page, we can be able to access this jack as a login, because we specified here it's a login. If you say it's an ID, you will treat that, you'll be able to treat this as an ID, but then we're gonna use login so we can keep the standard from GitHub, the standard GitHub used. And also, so in order for us to be able to access this, we need to use a hook from React router called use params. So this basically is gonna go to the URL and then get the parameters. Since we specified in this app here that our parameter is login, so we can be able to say, let's do this, use params. It returns an object of key value pairs of the dynamic parameters from. So since it returns objects containing the parameters, we can simply destructure the one that we need, which is the login. So this login will help us to fetch data that belong to this user. This is the ID that we actually going to use. So let's have here and head back to the API. So now we need to fetch information about the user you would have clicked on, right? So we need to return that user repositories and that user URL. So we need to fetch that user. It will return information like following, your blog or your bio, yeah, extra, etc, etc, right? So we need to go to this. So the URL we're gonna use is api.github/users, and the user here is gonna be the login. And then here for repositories, we're gonna say same thing, users/repos. But then for this, we're not necessarily going to use these parameters, right? We're not going to use this, unlike when in the first page where we are specifying the pages, and we're not going to do that in here. So what is it that we need? We need to, okay, let's have the use date again, where we're going to save information that we searched. Say user information constant user dot set user, let's say user info, set user information, and then user state, and let's give it an empty object, user repos. This is where we're going to store the repos we fetched from GitHub that belong to this user, and it's going to be an empty array. So also in here we're going to use a React hook, this one, the use effect, since we need to fetch this data on page load. So whenever this page loads, we need to go and fetch that specific user's information, right? So we're gonna have use effect, just like we did in that other file, but we don't necessarily need to have anything in the dependency array, because there is not going to be any changes. So whenever the page loads, you're going to fetch the data, and that's it, right? So let's implement the function called, what are we gonna call it, called fetch user information. It also needs to be asynchronous. So remember, we have two endpoints that we actually need. We have two routes that we actually need to visit. This one, where we're going to fetch the user's information, the following, the name, right? And then we also have this user repositories URL, where we're going to fetch that user's repos. So we're going to do two requests to GitHub when we visit the user page. So we need to actually search, we actually need to use this one and this one at the same time. So instead of having to use, okay, let me give you an example. Instead of having to say response, maybe say let's use user, and then say await, and then we also still need the Axios from our file, and get here where we get the user information, and having a response again, say repos, where we fetching repos. We can actually use let me show you what we can use. Instead of having something like this with multiple awaits, you can simply do, let's say, response, and use promise dot all, which allows you to pass an an array of promises, right? An array of promises. So it's a function which takes in an array, so we can just simply pass in uh the promises. Remember, this is a promise, so it needs to represent. So basically, let's just pass in here. We're gonna have Axios. So we no longer have to use the await. Axios dot get, let's use backticks. Remember, we are going to users slash forward user. We are going to users slash forward user. No, users. Okay, and then we specify the user we need to get. So we're going to use this, and then the user we need to get is specified by this login. So we're just gonna say login. So what else do we need? We also need to do Axios and get the repos now. Repos which also reside at users. Specify the user and you say repos. Remember in here, where is it? Here, users, and specify the user, and then you say repos. And then it also takes in the parameters that we are not going to use. So let's just simply leave them. Let's simply leave them. So let's remove this code since we are no longer going to use it because it's not important. So instead of having to write multiple await statements like this, you can just use the promise dot all function and then pass in all those promises. Yes. And then let's let's have a try catch block here. Console dot error and error. Let's try to display, let's just display response and see what it actually looks like, because we have done two fetches, right? Simply we can say we did two fetches. So let's see how this response looks like. Response, so we can be able to access the data that we need. We need to also call the function called fetch user information. So let's go to this page and see how it looks like. Okay, let me go back. Search Vincent. Sorry, and then open. Oh, and then go to console. So it returns an array that has two objects. The first object also has data. So this data is the user's data. So this is the user's data, the bio, the blog, the email about this user, the ID, their location, and then the actual name, instead of just having the login, because the login simply works just like an ID, and then it also has a name of this user. We have the URL. So this URL is the one we use to search this data, and then we also have the URL that directs us to GitHub. So you see here the github.com/Vincent. So this is where this users is specifically at on GitHub. So there are a bunch of stuff in here, but we're actually going to work with few. We're actually going to work with the following and the followers, the location, and usually on the block is your portfolio, where you'd have a portfolio, and then we have a bio here, and we also have the name for this. And then in the second object, so if you look at we have a second object here, it also has a data. The data is the array. We actually going to focus on the array, which is data, and then inside here we have the repos. So we are focusing on three things. What is this repo written in, or the language that is dominating, sorry, the language that is dominating in this repo, and then the description of that repo and the name of it. So we're going to focus on, here's the language. Also, what is it that we need? The description. Let's see if this thing is, we also need the description, and then we also need the name of this repo, and then here's the name of the repo. We're also gonna use, so when we click here, it should actually take us to GitHub, right, on this specific repo. So I believe there's also HTML. Is it what? HTML? Let's see before I say stuff that don't exist. Let me find where the users is. Yeah, there it is, HTML URL. So this is where this repo is located. So if I click here, it's gonna take me directly to GitHub, to this repo. So we can simply go back to our code. Let's go back to our code. So since this response is an array that contains two objects. So we have a response, which is an object that contains two objects. So we can say set user info. So the user information is in the first object, and then we're gonna go into data, and then we're gonna go into, so the first object, since it's an array, and then we take data. Also here we're gonna do the same thing, second, and then we take the data. Oh, why am I displaying it? And then we also need to say set repos response the second, and say data. So let me copy this part here and put it here, but then here we actually need the first one. Okay, so we need to display the information we searched, right, the information we just got back. Let's start with this here. Let's start with this guy here. Let's display the user. So okay, let's try to do this. Let's see what will happen. Let me remove this URL here. We no longer need Thor here. You can simply say user info, and do the training operator and say avatar URL. Then also here you can say user info name, and then this is the bio user info bio, and then here we're gonna display the followers. Here we're gonna display the user info following, and here we're gonna say user info followers. So if you look here, if you look at this, do you see the data is gone? if you look here into our user, not the config, we have followers, which returns the number, and following the number. You see here they displayed them. And let's deal with the portfolio and then the view GitHub profile. I think we didn't do that part. Also the location. So there are cases where the location is not specified. Let me look at this user here. Location is specified, but then if the location is not specified, it means this icon will be here, but then we won't have the name of the location here. So we need to actually check if we have the location, and if we have the location, we can then display it, right? So here we're gonna do a check. So we're only going to display this part. We're only going to display it only if location property exists. And then we're just gonna say user. Wow, we've been coding. And also there's a user that does not have the portfolio. We're gonna do the check, say user info, what is it, blog. So if this user has a blog, we're gonna display it here. And we don't necessarily need to have any check here because we know for sure this user exists on GitHub. So we're just gonna specify the URL in here, which is called what? It's called user HTML URL, right? Yes, here's it. So we're just gonna say user info HTML URL. So whenever we click this, it will simply take us to GitHub and see this user's profile. Let's save and head back to our code here. Let's search someone different. Let's say madam. I don't know, madam. Yes, mad. Boom. You see, we have their portfolio, or whatever this link is, and then their location, their followers, and the following, and a bit of description about them, and then the name, and obviously their avatar. Beautiful picture. So now let's display their repos, right? Their repos which we saved in the repos here. So also here instead of having this mess here, we can simply go into our UI and have a file here called repo.js, and we're gonna import our friend React. Oh no, this is not the guy we need. Constant repo for now. And obviously as a prop, let's go to user page and grab this and get into a repo here and paste those guys. Oh no, what is the problem now? Oh no, I don't need this. No, let me paste this and remove this one. So it means in here we grab the stuff that we don't need. So let's remove all the repos here, just like we did with the users, right? because we no longer need this mock data. Let's remove it, and then we're gonna display repos if we have them. Say repos repos.map repo. What is the ID, the key? Let's see how it looks. So each repo has an ID too, which is cool. We're gonna say repo.id, and then let's go into a repo and display the information that we need. So we're gonna destruct a few things from repo. We're gonna need the name, we need the HTML URL, which is the GitHub URL for this repo, and then we need the description, and we also need the language that it was written in. And then we say repo. So here the name comes here, the name comes here. Here we have a description, then here written in. So if we don't have the language, so let's have a check here. Language, if the language is not available, just gonna leave it, and then here we display language. Because think about it this way, if you don't have this check, it's gonna say written in, and then it checks language. If language is not available, just gonna return null. It's gonna say written in null, so we don't need to have a written in null. We just want to check if language exists. Okay, cool. What is it written in language? And then here the HTML URL, here we haven't used it, just need to specify here. Okay, cool. Oh, we still have some errors in here. What's going on? Oh, display no repos for this user. All right, let's also come in here and save. Hope it works. There we go. We have the user and then all the information related to the user. Also, we can see the repos under this user. We have avocado book, social network created with Bootstrap, social network created with Bootstrap, bulletin board, and then you can also open this. We are actually going to GitHub and opening their repo from there, and then you see, I think we have pretty much done everything there is to do. Okay, let's just remove this console log. Yeah, I think we are. Oh, also before I head out, there's a small issue that I saw that the previous video I didn't fix. So here on the user information, I used this instead of actually having to use a class to specify that it's a class. I was tired when I recorded the last video. So yeah, this is basically it. Dot image. I don't even think it's gonna change that much. Yeah, it didn't change much, but you guys might have picked it that an image. What is that? So we needed to say dot image to specify the div that we were actually dealing with. So let's go back and do one last more search. Let's say Meta, let's say Facebook, and then we can open this. and then you see all the information, also the repos. Yes, I think this is the end of the video. So guys, if you enjoyed it, listen attentively. If you enjoyed it, please do not forget to like the video, leave a comment down below and most importantly, please guys do subscribe to my videos. More is still coming. Thank you.